Hey everyone, good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here with you all. This is a little unnerving of a format because I can't see you, and I really appreciate, I would love to see you all, and I really appreciate getting feedback while I'm speaking, but we'll have some time for questions at the end. So if you want to put anything in the chat, that's great. My name is Diane O'Connell. I am a community lawyer at the Law Project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And I have been working, trying to help people get IDs and birth certificates and social security cards and all of that for about 8 years. This presentation is in some ways not very linear. I tried to make it as straightforward as possible, but I feel like the ID problem is really something you need to be able to go at from all angles and just kind of keep chipping away at. So it's not necessarily always a step-by-step process. If you are a person who works with people experiencing homelessness, you probably know a lot of what I'm about to say. But just as background, here are some reasons that people need IDs in order to work, in order to get housing, in order to open a bank account or cash a check, in order to travel these days, especially flying, and for enrolling in school. Although if you have a barrier enrolling in school, you should absolutely reach out to us. So why don't people have IDs? A lot of times people have just had very unstable lives. They've lost all their possessions. They have had to leave their family home. If they're a young person, it was often the family who was sort of in charge of those things. And if that relationship breaks down, there can be a big issue there replacing them. A lot of times it does have to do with immigration status, or of course, people just routinely lose and get their IDs stolen, especially when they're living in congregate settings like shelters, or if they have had to live outside or on the train. This is unfortunately common. So this is a little graphic that I think, people who have worked on this issue can relate to pretty easily. It sometimes feels like you are just caught in this cycle of not being able to get an ID, because in order to get an ID, you need to have an ID. And especially, I have found the social security card can be a big problem for folks who don't have a photo ID, because it is a very important element in getting a photo ID. So there's often, a back and forth that happens between those two things. I will say, and we're going to go through this, that during the pandemic, there's been additional challenges getting all of these items, but the good news is that it's possible to get all of these items right now. As far as I know, there's not any, there have been times in the last year when it was actually impossible. The Secretary of State's office was closed for months at various points, but currently everything is operating on at least a limited basis, and you should be able to access these documents. So we're going to go through renewing or replacing an Illinois state ID, getting an Illinois ID for the first time, getting a social security card, and then getting birth certificates from Illinois and other states. So I see people are putting things in the chat. I'm not going to monitor it right now, but we will go through this at the end. So this document is something that I suggest getting very familiar with. When I do outreach, I carry it around with me. It does change every now and then, so I try to, you know, look at the Secretary of State website and grab it. Instead of, you know, when I run out of copies, I'll go get it again instead of just making a copy of the old one, because sometimes things change. But the two things that we're going to focus on off of this is a 2-page document. So this is the first page, which tells you what the documents you need. And then the second page, which we'll look at next, has a list of all those documents. And the two categories that we're going to focus on here, because they are almost exclusively the things that I've dealt with in the last 8 years, are getting a first-time Illinois ID and getting a duplicate Illinois ID because yours has been lost or stolen. There are obviously a lot of other things that you might need, a driver's license, a temporary visitor's driver's license, but I really have not had those come up very often. Oh, for some reason I'm having difficulty getting to my next slide. I wonder what I can do about that. 1 second. What if I share again? Okay, sorry about that. So here is the second page. And again, I just really recommend keeping this and always looking back at it. So, I mean, the main things are that's important to remember is that for getting a replacement ID, you actually only need to have a document from Group A, unless you are also trying to change your address. And obviously changing your address is very important these days. Sorry, not obvious, but it is important to have the correct address, because since the Real ID Act was passed, your ID will be mailed to you always. So you have to be using an address on the ID that you're going to actually get your mail at. And so we're going to talk about the homeless status certification letter, which serves as both Group A and Group D, and will be the only thing that you need to replace your Illinois ID if you've already had one. And occasionally we'll have clients, not to get too into the weeds here, but who will actually get a replacement ID without a homeless letter, where we previously certified their homelessness, and then their new ID will get mailed to our office because they went ahead and paid the fee. And if you're not changing the address, you don't need a new homeless letter. You just need a proof of signature, which could also be a debit card or a social security card or something like that. So for a replacement ID, you need something from Group A, and D, if you're changing your address. For a new ID, you need something that satisfies each of these categories. And again, this is just a document you're probably going to need to refer back to a lot of times if you keep working on this. So I just covered this, and I really want to hammer home this point, though, because this is actually something that I was working on, you know, helping people get IDs for years, and I was actually misinforming people on this topic, because I thought that even with the homeless letter, you would still need to have some other documents, because I thought that it was only proof of residency and a fee waiver. But actually, it is also proof of signature. So again, if the person has already had an Illinois state ID, this is the only thing they need. And I learned that from my clients at TLP drop-in, back when it was called TLP, who would just tell me that that was the only thing they needed. And finally, I started listening to them. And so this is a way that you as a service provider can really help people immediately solve this problem. This is the homeless status certification, which, colloquially known as the homeless letter. And you'll see that it does need to be filled out and signed on the front by the client. And it needs to be filled out and signed on the back by a attorney or a employee of a homeless service agency. And it has to be notarized on both sides. So just a word about notarizing. A notary does not actually have to see an ID to notarize the document. They just have to have knowledge of the person's identity. So a witness attesting to the person's identity can be a basis to have a document notarized. If you go to, the currency exchange, they probably won't do it. And so a lot of us have had to, become notaries ourselves, or work with notaries who work at our agency or at other agencies to get these things done. But again, this is the document that makes the ID free and will be the key to getting a person a replacement ID in Illinois. It can also be filled out by a school homeless liaison. So this is my gift from Bernie, that this is obviously a very, very helpful thing. And unfortunately, it's not the answer to everybody's problem, and we know that. So now we're going to get into some of the limits of the homeless letter. One that I see very often is that, so the process is when you go down to the Secretary of State, and this is whether you have a homeless letter or whether you're just getting an ID for the first time or whatever, they give you a temporary ID that day, which is a little cardstock, black and white ID that's good for 45 days. And it is, they're going to mail the permanent ID to the agency that certified the homelessness. So it's not possible for you to certify somebody's homelessness on the homeless letter if you're not willing to also receive their mail and be responsible for delivering their mail to them, which obviously during the pandemic is a big challenge. We occasionally do it for people. And since our office is closed, it's a challenge to keep track of all of our mail these days. We also, over the years, have just had a lot of issues getting our mail for some reason. And so it's not really always going to work. Sometimes we do it because we just feel that the person has no other option and it's important. But that is one big kind of shortcoming with the process, is that, you give them the letter and then you also have to be sure that you're actually in touch with them so you can deliver the ID, and that your agency is going to, responsibly handle and, retain this person's mail. Also, if they register to vote, you will get the voter registration card. It'll come to your office. And sometimes the client will then continue to use the ID for various things, and you'll get random mail for them, jury duty or phone bills or things like that. And then another big limit on it is that you cannot use it for a client who's housed. And so obviously a lot of us work with people who, maybe we met them when they were homeless or whatever. Maybe they've never been homeless, but they were at risk of homelessness at some point, et cetera. But the letter is only for people who are homeless as defined by federal law. So the McKinneyVento Act is the federal law definition that is the most sort of broad, and it's the one that we use. And so certainly this includes people who are doubled up with other people, and that, sharing somebody else's house, even if it's for a long time. If it's not their own unit and they can't afford to live on their own, or they can't find, for whatever reason, they don't have their own place, that's still fine. But occasionally I have clients who have, been in supportive housing for years who will, ask to get one of these letters. And in those situations, I always just offer to pay the fee, because I feel like, you know, there is a point at which that person does not qualify anymore. This is just a note. You do have a legal obligation to return the ID if the client doesn't pick it up in 60 days. This is pursuant to the Real ID Act. So if the client does not pick up, if you do the homeless letter and you get the ID and then you don't see the client for 60 days, you are required by law to send it back to the Secretary of State. So if you are a person who is not homeless, who needs to get your Illinois ID replaced or renewed, you're going to need proof of signature. You can always refer back to that document. But the most common ones that a person might actually have are their social security card, their debit card, possibly a court order if they've had a name change. And they're not required to prove their address again unless their address is changed, and they will have to pay the fee, which is $10. Here's just a rundown of the fees. This is not an exhaustive list. There are also free IDs for people who have a police report. If they got their wallet stolen and actually reported it, they could get a free ID with the police report. Or there is a process to get a free ID if you're a person with a disability. These are the most common ones that I see. And of course, this all that we've talked about so far is really about document gathering, but we know that in order to get a state ID, you actually have to physically be able to access the Secretary of State building, driver's services facilities. And as I said, there has been points during the last year when they have actually been closed, which I personally think is nuts because I can't think of anything more vital than being able to get an ID. I feel that if restaurants can be open, the Secretary of State Driver's Services Office should be open at least by appointment, you know, in some capacity. But currently they are open, so that's you know, fantastic. But they do have limited hours. Some of the offices that I most often have gone to, the one on the west side, the one on King Drive, both of those are closing at 2 right now, I believe. So just check online to make sure what the hours are before you send somebody down there, of course. I would not be surprised if they closed again, if the you know, the percentages of the positivity rate goes up a lot or something like that. It's very conceivable. So just check online first. And then not all the locations are open. There are at least 3 that are just closed until further notice. And unfortunately, one of those is the one that was in the Thompson Center downtown. And that one I felt was a good one because it was right by all the trains and it was very familiar with the homeless letter. So it was typically a pretty reliable place to send a person to get their ID replaced, but it's not an option right now. But yeah, so just check online if somebody's, you know, committed to this. I would recommend that they figure out where they're going, figure out if it's open, what the hours are, and then plan to get there early and expect to wait in line. I haven't personally gone down there, but I have driven by. And the one on the west side, I've noticed, does have very long lines out the door. So moving on, for people who need a new ID, and what I mean by new is first-time Illinois State ID applicant. For these folks, they're going to need, you know, again, referencing in your head back to that Secretary of State document. They're going to need something from each category. Some things count twice, but they're going to need proof of signature, proof of date of birth, social security number, and residency. The homeless letter counts for the written signature and the residency, but not for the date of birth or social security number. And that means most people will usually need their birth certificate and their social security card. There are some exceptions. especially if the person has some kind of federal documentation. If they're, I mean, if they were in the military or they have a passport, but of course, most of our clients don't have those. If they had a passport, they wouldn't be so desperately in need of an ID to begin with. We'll discuss some of these exceptions more. Right, so for other things that will serve for your date of birth that some of our folks might have or be able to get, if they get Social Security benefits, then they're a primary beneficiary. They can get the copy of their SSI award letter that'll have their date of birth on it. If they're an immigrant who has a green card, or if they have naturalized, there are some other documents too that I haven't seen as much, but there are some other immigration documents on that list that you can look at. And a certified school transcript, which has definitely been one that we've helped people get when they couldn't get their birth certificate. So I'm going to go through getting birth certificates in Cook County, then getting birth certificates in other counties in Illinois, and then getting birth certificates in other states. So in Cook County, for the last few years, birth certificates there was a change in 2017 that made birth certificates free for people who are homeless, people who have been released from IDOC or the Cook County Department of Corrections in the last 90 days, and for residents of domestic violence shelters. If not, it costs $15. This is the form to get the free birth certificate. I don't know how many attorneys are on this call, but if you are an attorney who is filling out this form and you actually plan to get the birth certificate for the person, you will fill out the bottom section of both the first and second page. And the client will fill out the top section of the first page. But you don't have to be an attorney. This is a document where if the homeless service provider verifies, or someone else, I suppose, in a position to verify the either the recent incarceration release, the domestic violence, or the homelessness, you would fill out the bottom section of the second page, and then you can give this document to the person and they can go to Vital Records to get their birth certificate. Again, this is just Cook County. So Cook County has pretty lax requirements for IDs compared to most places that I've ever seen. Obviously, if the person has a photo ID, they're good, but they can also provide 2 of the following documents. These are all listed on the Cook County Vital Records website. And if they have that letter, the letter certifying the homelessness, I would suggest that they might even be able to get away with something that's not on this list. If they have like a letter from a government agency, from IDHS or something like that, and they have their homeless verification, the A3 form that we just looked at, we have been told that the clerk is not trying to, they're trying to be helpful and not send people away because they understand that, this is a big problem. So I do think that's also kind of a lesson to take away from the broader presentation, is that, these lists are, they're there for a reason, and sometimes they're helpful for you because people will try to tell you you don't have the thing you need, and you can point to the list and say, yes, I do. But there are also times when it's just worth trying and seeing what happens. I mean, maybe they don't have a utility bill, but maybe they have a copy of their lease or something like that, or, a copy of something else that looks somewhat official. I think sometimes it's just worth a try. And then, of course, it is very helpful to know that when a client has absolutely no documents, a lawyer is often a big help in this process, because in Illinois and in most states under the Vital Records Act, lawyers are entitled to get their clients' birth certificates, whether or not they have any form of ID for the client. The lawyer can use their own ID and get these documents. So this is something that we at the coalition do a lot of. And it's something that we are happy to help with for people who do not have any other options. And if there are any other lawyers on the call, just know that, you know, if you want to get somebody's birth certificate for them, it's a good idea to bring a signed letter by that person. In Cook County, a signed letter will do it. In some places, they might want a signed notarized letter, but something that says that you represent the person and they have authorized you to get their birth certificate. This is the fundamental questions you're going to want to ask somebody if they need help getting their birth certificate. You need to know their full legal name at birth, the date of birth, the mother's maiden name. That's you know, something people get wrong a lot or they get confused about. Even caseworkers and other people will often write down just the mother's name and forgetting to ask if it had ever been changed. The father's name, if it's on the birth certificate. Of course, the city, county, and state of birth. If they don't know the county, you know, you can look that up, no big deal. And if they were adopted, you need to know that they were adopted in the names of the adopted parents at the time of the adoption and the state that they were adopted in. So again, I already covered that birth certificates are free in Cook County for folks who fit into one of those categories: homeless, victims of domestic violence, people who were recently incarcerated. And also, I did forget to mention, they are free for nonprofits who represent these people too. So if you want to get it for the person, either by mail, which you can do in Illinois, or if you're an attorney who is authorized to get it without the person being present because you have your own ID, it will be free with that form if you work at a nonprofit. We also now have a state law that makes birth certificates free statewide for people who are homeless. Otherwise, it costs $10. So just a word of advice, because I used to actually do this. If somebody was born in like Will County or Lake County or DuPage or something like that, I would not bother trying to go through those counties to get the birth certificate. I would contact the Illinois Department of Public Health directly. The counties sometimes really do not understand the state law, and they have their own weird rules, and they will just send you letters denying it, saying that they need more documentation, la-di-da-di-da-di. But the Illinois Department of Health overall has been very helpful and very much understands both that these are supposed to be free for homeless people, and also that attorneys, again, if you are an attorney, are entitled to get these. This is the Illinois Department of Public Health form to get the free birth certificate for a homeless person who qualifies. They do ask that you put this on letterhead if you're a nonprofit who's helping a person get this. So getting a birth certificate for a minor or a child is a little bit more complicated, just in the sense that you are not generally allowed to do it without the parents' permission. We used to have a really hard time with this in Cook County, but we did convince them that minors who are unaccompanied in Cook County should be able to get their own birth certificate or get a have an attorney get it for them. So we have a letter that we use for that also. But if you are trying to help a parent get their child's birth certificate, you will want a signed letter from the parent. Again, this is really only applicable to attorneys because normally the parent's going to be the requester if it's not the parent's lawyer. But if it is the parent's lawyer, you're going to need a specific letter that says the parent is authorizing you to get the document for their child or for them, you know, because they're the parent. For an unaccompanied minor who's from another state, I'm not sure if you can actually do it. I mean, I think it's probably worth a try, but I think it's going to be difficult without the parent's consent. So out-of-state birth certificates, one of our, I'm sure all of our favorite things to do, because you just never know what's going to happen. If you're an attorney, and again, when I say this, I also mean like, or if you want to contact us for help, because this is one of the things we do, and we're happy to try to help. And I'll have my contact information at the end. But generally speaking, we can help. In most states, we can get a birth certificate for a client through the mail. And we always are going to submit a notarized authorization if it's going out of state. It does sometimes take a very long time. I put 2 to 8 weeks, but I've definitely seen 3-4 months. But sometimes it's really fast and efficient. And sometimes you deal with like a random state that you really don't know what to expect, and you have a very pleasant experience. I had to get one from Montana for the first time over the summer, and they were just so lovely. And it was amazing. And then there are some states that are just nightmares and will absolutely not give it to you. One of those is Michigan, which is unfortunate because it's so close to Illinois that we do get a fair number of those requests. And currently, we are not able to get birth certificates from Michigan. So for those folks, those are people who I recommend, if their goal is to get a state ID, to really study that list closer and see if there's anything else they can get that will have their date of birth on it that satisfies the document requirements. And also, of course, if they have a family member, a parent in the state that they still have a relationship with, that's always worth a try. So if you really need to get, chip away at a problem, there may be a few different things you could try with an out-of-state one, because again, there are multiple entities who have access to these documents. Of course, there's the state and there is the county. And actually in some cities, there are, for some reason, they have their own vital records department. I don't know why this is, but New York City and San Antonio, Texas, both have their own vital records for people who were born there. And you do actually need to request the birth certificate from the city, at least for NYC. I'm not sure about San Antonio. For Texas, you might be able to get it from the state and the city. But in any case, there are multiple places you can try. And of course, there is always Vital Check. I'm sure, if you Google it, you're going to see that one of the first things that comes up is that you can order it online through Vital Check. I personally do not use Vital Check. I have tried it on numerous occasions, especially when it was a big hurry, because, at least at our office, we need to, for an out-of-state one, we're going to need to get a check issued, which especially with the pandemic, there's been sometimes some significant delays just getting the check request and then actually, going to the office and getting the physical thing. So sometimes if there's, a big hurry, I have tried to do it on Vital Check with a credit card. But personally, I have found that it's not usually helpful. I mean, I have heard some success stories, but for me, it hasn't worked. I sometimes think the people who review the documents on Vital Check, I really don't know, but sometimes I think the people who review them are not actually people who work for the state. And sometimes maybe reject things arbitrarily, just because they haven't seen it before, not because it's actually wrong. So I don't use it, but it might be worth a try. Try again. Like I said, I've heard all type of random success stories. So it's always worth a try if you think it might work. And also, you can always read the Vital Records Act of a state, because sometimes if you want to take that legal dive into the law, there's you never know what it might actually say. So sometimes people might deny the thing and say you're not entitled to get it. But then if you take a close look, really, you do have entitlement to it. I know this is a lot of, I just realized how long I've been talking. I feel like I have really been working on this for a long time, and there's a lot of information out there, and I'm sure that you all have questions, but I promise we're near the end here. So the social, Cook County Vital Records, if I did not mention that, it's open, but it moved. It's no longer in the downstairs of the Daily Center. It moved to 118 North Clark on the first floor. So the Social Security card is going to be sometimes the hardest thing to get and is very key to getting a state ID. It serves as both proof of signature and proof of your Social Security number, which if you aren't a person who gets Social Security benefits and has that beneficiary award letter, this is going to be something you're going to really need. And in order to get your Social Security card, you are probably going to need proof of citizenship and another secondary form of ID. Technically, you could order a Social Security card online, and people always ask me if you can do this. It's technically possible, but I've never successfully done it. I actually tried to do it for myself just to see if I could, and I was not able to do it. They say you can do it with an ID, which I haven't tried to do because that's the reason we need it, right? But they also have a process where you can answer security questions and supposedly do it without an ID. And even for myself, I was not able to successfully answer the security questions that they asked me. So I sort of doubt that that's ever going to work for one of my clients. But again, it might be worth a try. Most likely the client is going to have to go to the Social Security office and request this in person. Yesterday I called 605 West Washington, the big one downtown, and they told me that the offices are open by appointment only for cases of dire need. So my advice is call the office and make the case that this is important and the person really needs it, and ask for an appointment. If you don't, if you're unsuccessful in getting one, give me a call. The woman I spoke with yesterday really made it sound like this was a thing that they were doing, and it should be possible. So this is the issue for people who don't have IDs to get their Social Security card. They're going to need a secondary form of ID that has their name and date of birth on it that is recent. So most folks that we work with don't have a school ID or work ID that is current. And I have had people try to get it with, like an old work ID or something like that, and that doesn't work. They really need to see something that's current. The most success that I've had is getting medical records from the last 2 years, because most people have been to the doctor in the last 2 years, and medical records are attainable just by having them sign a HIPAA form. Either maybe your agency has one, or you can get one from the hospital or doctor, or this is something you can manufacture. You can send them to a clinic to get an AIDS test or an HIV test, or something like that. You can get them an appointment and then get a copy of the record, and that is something that Social Security accepts. Here is the list of all the secondary ID that Social Security will accept. Also important to note, they will not accept the temporary ID that people get from the Secretary of State. So don't send somebody down there with that carbon copy black and white thing, because they don't take it. You'll be sent all these slides after too, so I can share this document. This is not available online. I got this at the office. It does get a little bit trickier for people who weren't born in the United States, just because I have seen that they get really, they do get really specific about wanting to have proof of legal status. So if this gets to be an issue, they may need to get a replacement of their green card, which if you've ever tried to do that, that takes quite a while as well. But these are some things that you can help people get to help them get their Social Security card, their school transcript. You may be able to help them get an insurance card if they have Medicaid and they're on a managed care plan. You can order one. But again, a lot of those don't work because it has to actually have their date of birth on it. So this is, you know, a school transcript. You're going to need to know what year they graduated, where it was, and you can order most of those online or by calling the school. Covered that. Okay, so takeaways. Study the sheet from the Secretary of State. Keep trying different things. Listen to the client. Often they have a situation where they really understand what they need and you don't. And sometimes if you're too much in the box, sort of used to getting these things, you might be misdirecting them. I certainly have done this before, as with, you know, not understanding that the homeless letter was really enough for just the replacement ID. I was sometimes telling people they needed to get more things that they didn't need. So I think it's important to just remember that, like, they might understand the situation a lot better than I do. Look for the helpers. This is, you know, obviously like just a lesson for life, but I mean, I have had some like remarkable people at Social Security and the Secretary of State who have really broken rules to get people IDs. I had a client this summer who was 17 and was like essentially undocumented just because he had been, his parent had died when he was young and he had been like homeless and never legally adopted, and like his name had been changed when he was a baby, and it was just a disaster. And this woman at the Social Security office, who was just like an angel, accepted like a photocopy of a birth certificate that his aunt had that was really old and just gave him the card. And I've seen people like that, you know, at the Secretary of State too, who have helped in really tricky conversation situations. So sometimes if you have a nice person who's willing to listen, you can really explain to them how hard it is, and, you know, they might be able to do something. Call a lawyer. This is my phone number. This is my cell phone number and my email address here. This is the Law Project's number. We would like to help. I put call my lawyer or mom because I think sometimes parents are really helpful in getting IDs because, like I said, they have these documents and they're also legally entitled to get the birth certificate. But of course, if you don't have that, you might need a lawyer. So I can take questions now, and thank you so much.
Can you hear me, Diane?
I am just pulling up the chat. Where did it go? Okay, let's see. Can you get a state ID if your driver's license is involved in the courts and you're waiting on the court date? So I guess this is, if I'm understanding the question correctly, this has to do with your license maybe being suspended or something like that, or in danger of being suspended. So then the question is, can you get an ID even if you can't have a driver's license? I believe the answer is yes. I can't say I've dealt with that specifically. They had a car accident. Okay. Maybe reach out to me more about that question. I'm not sure that I understand exactly why that would prevent them from getting an ID, but yeah, I mean, I think they should be able to get an ID. Okay. To clarify, should clients contact Secretary of State office for a new ID and Maine Social Security office for medical records? They should contact the Secretary of State office for a new ID. They won't be able to get their medical records from the Social Security office. They'll need to bring them with them to the Social Security office to get their Social Security card if they don't have a photo ID, the medical records, are a secondary form of ID that the Social Security Administration will accept. Where do I get the free birth certificate form? The forms are available. They're actually available on the CCH website, and it should be also on the Cook County Vital Records website. But if you Google, it's called the A3 form, and if you Google the Cook County free birth certificate A3 form, it'll come up. What about the Real ID? So the Real ID is not actually that new. It's been around for about 4 years now. Yeah, show my info again. I'm sorry. I stopped screen sharing because I was trying to look at the chat and I got a little overwhelmed. But okay, Real ID Act. Sorry, going back to that. It's not that new. So for most people, I feel like it's not very meaningful in the sense that most of our clients their ID is already going to be a Real ID if it was issued in the last 4 years. And if it's a new ID, that's the only kind they're issuing. So the Real ID, all those things on the letter where it says Real ID versus whatever, that's mostly meaningful for people who have an old ID. You know, they got a 10-year ID 6 years ago or 10 years ago, and now they need to renew it since the Real ID Act went into effect. Then the documents are going to be different. And I did also, oh, I forgot. I was going to tell you something else about the Real ID Act, but it just slipped my mind. I'm sorry. So, who can sign the homeless letter for a high school student? I actually was looking at the homeless letter, and I think anybody could, because I wonder if I can go back here. If you look closely at the letter, it actually just says you're certifying that the person is homeless and that they're receiving services from the agency. So you have to have a tax ID number, and you have to be an agency that gives services, and you have to have knowledge of the homelessness. But beyond that, I'm pretty sure anybody who fits into one of those categories could do it. So it could be a teacher or a guidance counselor or anybody really. Can they use the homeless letter if they're in a supportive housing program? Yeah, I was actually wondering that myself. You know, I may need to look more closely. That they can use it if they're homeless under any definition that is in federal law. That's what I know. So my clients who are in supportive housing, if they've been there, if it's their own unit and it's permanent and they've been there for a significant period of time, I don't use it anymore because I don't consider them to be homeless. Oh, okay, Patricia, my boss, says if it's transitional housing, yes. A tax ID number for an CPS liaison, you would use the school's tax ID number. Okay, how do you get the homeless certification letter notarized? You have to know a notary who wants to help you. So a lot of our agencies, I'm a notary, you know, we have several notaries that work at the Coalition for the Homeless, and there are shelters that also have folks who work there who are notaries. I will say, if you're interested in becoming a notary, it's not hard. Anybody can do it. I mean, it takes a few months, but it's worth it. It's a very helpful skill or sort of stamp. It's a very helpful stamp to have. It's not that expensive, and maybe your agency will pay for you to do that. If the birth certificate is for a child, do you need to have it notarized? It's always a good idea to have it notarized. I believe that we do typically notarize those letters. Yeah. Can a notary no. So the question is, can a notary who is the submitter complete both tasks on the application? The answer to that is no. So you won't be able to notarize a document that you yourself sign, no matter what document it is. So if you're trying to do a homeless letter, you're going to need 2 people from the agency. They don't have to both actually be present. You know, like since the pandemic, I've been doing it where like I'll go to my coworker's house, meet with him outside, he'll sign it, I'll notarize it. Then I'll go meet with the client outside, they'll sign it, notarize it, give it to the client. Is there a limit on the amount of replacements you can get? That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Somebody said yes, check with Featherfist. If you learn the answer to that, I would be interested to know. It's never, I do believe we've had somebody over the years say that, but I don't know what that limit is. Sylvia says a social security card limit is 10. Does a school ID count as a photo ID? It will, for the purposes of getting your social security card, if it's a current school ID and if it has your name and date of birth on it. Unfortunately, it has to have your date of birth on it, which I feel like, you know, a lot of IDs that people issue do not have that information. Some people are putting some other things in the chat about possible limits on the lost replacement IDs for the homeless letter. Can we use the consent to release information form for what? Oh, Puerto Rico birth certificates. Yeah, this comes up. We were just talking about this at CCH the other day. So I personally have never gotten one from there. My coworker did once do it through Vital Check. I have been told it's hard, but I have not tried to do it. I would be willing to give it a try though. If you have a person, if you're hitting a brick wall, I think it's possible for a lawyer to do it. But again, I have heard that it's hard. And I used to live there, and I do know that it's they're very committed to their bureaucracy there. So it could definitely be challenging, but I think it's possible. School ID with no DOB, could you also include a signed letter with the letterhead stating the student's date of birth? I think you could try that. I would see that as being similar to like a school transcript. I mean, if you work at the school and you have access to, if you can provide a certified school transcript that has their date of birth on it, that should work too. So you could send them with both. Does the parent need to notarize their request letter? Yeah, I think I tried to answer that. I think it's a good idea. Whether it's absolutely necessary in Cook County, I'm not sure, but we as a practice, we do notarize it when it's a parent signing. Okay, I think I answered that already. So I believe I hope I didn't miss anything. Okay, we think that's it. All right, everybody. Well, thank you again. And I'm happy to, you know, bang these out, like talk through these problems with you. It can be a very satisfying experience to help a person get an ID when they haven't had one for a long time. So I'd be happy to try to help if I can. And thank you so much for all the work that you do. And I hope everybody is staying safe and staying positive and just, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.